The following program was produced by the University of Iowa, with support from State Historical Society Incorporated, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Iowa Arts Council.
I thought, Iowa City, I'm not going to drive out there. That's the wilds.
It just seemed a little desolate to me compared to New York. I worried that I would feel very lonely.
There was an almost folkloric concern of producing a literature that was native to the Midwest.
There weren't that many people who wanted to come to such a program. It was vaguely disreputable.
There was a heavy political scene and a heavy literary scene, and they blended perfectly.
It was replicating itself all across the country.
You know, one by one, people check out of the gamble.
I don't like quiet places.
Adverbs are toxic.
A writer is somebody who writes.
Every reader is a writer.
You couldn't stop Paul. Paul was a steamroller.
So all writers from the world ought to come to Iowa City.
They want to be told what they can do to move to the next level, and that can be hard to hear.
We take literacy and literature seriously.
We are dealing with artists whose form is language.
Iowa City was once the state capital of Iowa in the mid-19th century, though it soon lost that distinction to Des Moines, 100 miles west. Today, Iowa City is home to a major research university, but for more than a century, it has been a haven for writers. The Iowa Writers' Workshop is the oldest creative writing program in America. The International Writing Program has brought foreign writers to Iowa for more than 4 decades. Alumni and faculty from the University of Iowa have been awarded over 40 Pulitzer Prizes, and Iowa City was recently named an International City of Literature. How did Iowa become a literary crucible? In the mid-1800s, creative writing wasn't worthy of academic study.
When the University of Iowa was founded in 1847, writing was not taught. And indeed, the very idea that you would cultivate self-expression as part of a college education was really not instituted. The university was formed in order to enhance the economy of the state and in order to provide lawyers, doctors, engineers, a professional class for what was at that point a frontier state. So the degree to which English was studied, it was studied philologically, linguistically, scientifically. And the idea of creative self-expression sort of emerged against that scientific research ideal.
During the frontier period of Iowa, there were really people who were self-made men and women. They taught themselves by reading. There were a lot of home libraries that gave them entree to the classics of literature. Of course, a lot of people brought their Bibles with them, but they were also reading Shakespeare, but they were also being introduced to American writers. And for example, in Iowa City in 1867, Mark Twain came to town and gave a lecture. So they were really celebrating what was unique about the frontier experience, about living in the Midwest. That started very, very early in this town.
Students were responsible for the first writing opportunities on Iowa's campus. Literary societies were formed to gain cultural enrichment. The groups met at the Old Capitol, where they recited classical and popular poetry.
The journey of our life, I found myself within a forest.
There is nothing in thy track to bid me fondly stay, while the swift seasons hurry.
Over time, the groups became writing clubs, where members would discuss the craft of writing and share their own work.
The trend for literary societies had already been established on East Coast universities, including Harvard and Yale, but it took a different slant here in Iowa, partly because we're on the frontier and it's a more egalitarian environment where you have men and women in a coeducational environment for really the first time. That's happening west of the Mississippi in that era. So those literary societies were really a proving ground for young men and women to practice writing short stories, poetry, share it with others, and get some feedback and criticism from their fellow classmates.
It wasn't long before imaginative writing classes appeared in the university catalog. Verse making was taught in spring 1897 by George Cram Cook, an Iowa native educated at Harvard. Cook and his colleagues participated in the writing clubs.
There were many local writing clubs in Iowa City, and many of these actually were encouraged by and participated in by early faculty. Not only were these writing clubs important in terms of trying to elevate the Midwest as a literary center, they also were early models for the workshop form. In other words, the idea that you could develop your writing in small groups as opposed to individually. The important thing about the clubs is their regionalist focus. So there was an almost folkloric concern of producing a literature that was native to the Midwest. So there was a real resistance to the dominance of Boston and New York and the East Coast, and a sense that the Midwest could produce its own indigenous literature.
No one believed this more than John T. Frederick, a native Iowan and University of Iowa professor who founded the Midland magazine in 1915.
Well, I think the reason that regionalism developed in this town was partly because of people like John T. Frederick or Benjamin Shambaugh, who had opportunities to make their name on the East Coast or at much more prestigious old guard Ivy League schools, but instead turned their attention to Iowa, a place they were proud to be from. They knew there were many unexplored avenues for telling stories, being very authentic about the people and characters around them, the experiences that they witnessed. And so those proponents, both Frederick and Shambaugh, were key to developing this idea of regionalist writing in Iowa.
For 2 decades, the Midland published stories and poetry of regional authors, establishing Iowa City as a literary hub and paving the way for a new academic discipline. Psychologist Carl Seashore, known for his work measuring musical and scholastic aptitude, was head of the graduate college when, in 1922, Iowa became the first major university to accept creative work for advanced degrees. In this environment, the arts would flourish. E.C. Mabie's theater program gained national prominence. Grant Wood made a regionalist imprint on Iowa's art school. And Iowa's graduate students produced compositions, paintings, and poetry collections. Among them were writers Wallace Stegner and Paul Engel. Engel's collection of poems would be the first University of Iowa graduate thesis to be published. But while creative writing was taking root, the university's English curriculum still emphasized scholarship. John Frederick expressed his concern in a letter to the university president.
I know that you are fully aware of the many evidences of a rapidly awakening literary consciousness in Iowa. In recent years, however, the tendency in our English department has been toward increased emphasis upon philological investigation. It dominates our graduate work to the almost complete exclusion of creative effort. Within a few years, by the continuation of this process, our leadership in creative effort in our region will be lost.
Fortunately, Norman Foerster shared Frederick's belief in the academic merit of creative writing.
He had trained with Irving Babbitt at Harvard, and in fact, many of the initial innovators here were native Midwesterners who'd gone to Harvard. And he very much felt that creative and critical writing should be integrated. So he was the one who put in place the vision that Seashore shared with him, which is to make academic credentialing more friendly to artistic production, to creative writing.
By the 1930s, literary groups like the Times Club brought prominent writers to Iowa City to read for enthusiastic audiences, and the university would continue this tradition. Though the program in creative writing was formalized in 1936, it was not until 1939 that it had a director. Harvard graduate Wilbur Schramm came to Iowa for a PhD in English literature. But Schramm was a talented writer. He'd published stories in popular magazines, and as an assistant professor, he led small writing classes that were intimate and lively. The course was given an industrial-inspired nickname, the Writer's Workshop.
The term workshop clearly has a craft orientation, and the logic behind it, I think, is at least partly to justify to university administrators that actually writing can be taught. This question constantly dogs creative writing programs, which is that if talent is what you need in order to write well, then what can actually be taught, like you might teach a craft or a science. So the workshop form, it was talent can be cultivated, it can be discovered, it can't be taught, but you can teach craft, right? You can teach form, you can teach the mechanics of creative writing.
Despite his writing talent, Schramm was more interested in the new field of mass communication, and in 1942, went to work for the war effort in D.C. The English department turned to one of its own to lead the creative writing program.
Paul Engel was born and raised in Cedar Rapids. He was a small-town kid. His father bought and sold horses. He was educated first at Coe College and then wrote one of the first creative theses at the University of Iowa in the 30s. And the collection of poems that was his thesis, he renamed it Worn Earth, and it won the Yale Younger Poets Prize. And his next book, American Song, was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review.
There is a spirit in us that has sprung from the nostalgic memory of the race, the feel of certain words under the tongue, the infinite features of the human face, remembrance of wind cruel cold in the bone, the songs of men and all their wailful crying, the strange thoughts of a child left all alone, a long eternity of birth and a dying.
So in the late 30s, it would have appeared that Paul Engel was a promising young poet. In the end, he would become instrumental, if not necessarily well known, as a person of somewhat rarer talents, which is he would become an academic entrepreneur.
My office, where I work, where I spend most of my life, it's in the basement of my house. I'm so happy to be able to work in my home.
24/7 is my cabin off the grid, 8,000 feet up in the mountains in northern New Mexico, on the high road between Santa Fe and Taos. The only thing that would make it noisy is if I pull out some firearms.
I don't like quiet places. If I'm in a cabin in the woods and I can hear a bird song, maybe a dog walk or click across the hardwood floor and everything is quiet and peaceful, I go ape. I don't like it. I wonder what's on TV and who can I call on the telephone.
I work best in motion. I work really well on the New York City subway. I work really well on planes, but always with earplugs. I have to have earplugs on. It's like my earplugs and a pen, and that's how I get through the world, and a journal.
I find, I suppose, like most writers, that writing never really stops. You know, you're working all the time. You carry your characters around with you. You see things in the street, in conversations, in overheard bits of dialogue on the train or the bus.
I usually write in bed. The good thing about writing in bed is not because I'm very, very lazy. I was once in nicer years, but it's because I can fall asleep and drift away into dreams and then wake up and immediately write. And I find writing immediately after I've woken up is the best time.
In 1942, Iowa was known for agriculture, not creative writing, when 34-year-old Paul Engel took over as director of the Writers' Workshop. Engel earned one of the university's first graduate degrees for creative work. He would then study at Columbia and later Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He traveled throughout Europe and upon returning to the U.S., was hired onto the workshop faculty.
The first important thing I think to know about him is that he was a native Midwesterner, and he always maintained very much a sense of him as a Middle Westerner from the middle of the country. His reputation was in many ways very middle-brow, and he was proud of that middleness. He, from very early on, was a champion of the Middle West, and like many of his compatriots, he was someone who had been educated on the East Coast and wanted to bring some of that cultural status and some of that level of literary education to the Midwest.
I was the first person in my family, as far back as we know, ever to go to college. And my mother was the first person ever to finish school. My father did not. Why I wanted to go so desperately, I don't know, but I did. And I had a very interesting childhood. We were terribly poor people. I was a newsboy. I sold newspapers on the streets. I bought them for 1 penny and sold them for 2 pennies. And I worked in a drugstore. I went to school from 7:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon. And then I worked from 4 o'clock to midnight, 7 days a week. But I had a very nice boss in this drugstore, and he let me have a little desk in the back of the store. And when I was not selling magazines or ice cream or castor oil, I could write poetry there.
Once Engel took over the workshop in 1942, he promoted it with enormous energies. He ran the workshop as an autonomous program funded by local businesses. He was incredibly effective at fundraising, and he had no qualms about cultivating a relationship between business and literature. So he would bring his graduate students to the Amana Refrigeration Company, to other local businesses to raise money, and he actually initially funded scholarships by himself. So you had to have Engel's loyalties to be part of the workshop.
Not content to select his students from applications, Engel recruited like a football coach. He had an eye for talent and worked hard to bring promising writers to Iowa City. A literary networker, Engel persuaded acclaimed writers like Robert Frost, Dylan Thomas, and Robert Lowell to come to Iowa to lecture and teach. The heart of the writing program was the workshop itself, where small groups of students met with an instructor to discuss submitted works. Workshop classes met in barracks buildings, constructed as temporary classrooms to accommodate the influx of students after the war. As a result of the GI Bill, the students were predominantly male, but the star pupil of the time was Flannery O'Connor. The 1950s would see the Writers' Workshop develop a national reputation. Poetry magazine featured the work of Iowa students. Graduates published frequently. And Engel was a skilled promoter. He held literary conferences at Iowa in the late 1950s, bringing major writers to campus and getting national attention in Time, Newsweek, and Life. By 1960, when a workshop graduate won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry, Iowa City was becoming a literary mecca.
I had a Henry James professor at the University of Chicago who used to talk about the rural place he came from. A place so rural that the pigs came right up to the porch. And that was Iowa City. So I thought, Iowa City? I'm not going to drive out there. That's the wilds. So I took the bus. Paul Engel was running the workshop, and Donald Justice was the only poetry teacher. Admission, even then, was on the basis of manuscript. I don't think the manuscript I presented would have gotten me into the workshop, say 10 years later. But there weren't that many people who wanted to come to such a program. It was vaguely disreputable. It was totally informal. Those were the bohemian days, to be sure. The only reason the Writers' Workshop existed at the University of Iowa, so far as I can tell, is that nobody could stop Paul Engel.
Paul Engel brought all the sensitivities one needed to this. He was definitely committed to seeing that the word on the page got printed in a book so that readers could read it. He didn't leave it to just writing in a room without echoes and never sharing it with others. So he's a driving force. He brought fame to the Writers' Workshop. He brought authors to the Writers' Workshop. He was really the person who made it happen.
Paul Engel was not only an enormously effective academic and cultural entrepreneur, he came on the scene at a period when resources were being massively injected into the American university system to finance and enable its growth during the era of the GI Bill.
Like John T. Frederick in the Midland, Engel viewed the workshop's success as a personal mission, as evidenced by the literary greats he brought to Iowa.
Adverbs are toxic. Adverbs are the monosodium glutamate of speech.
One bad preposition construction that I always have to cut is, in my first draft, I always write off of, and really you're just supposed to write off. That's not very interesting, is it?
Shoes and cakes and the word tiny. I know because a reader wrote to me and made a list.
I would say that I usually cut more than I add. You know, since I'm a short story writer, I will usually blot out, most of the story.
I don't cut anything, and that would be the editor's job. And I get cut a lot because I write too much.
In the 1940s and 50s, Paul Engel shepherded the Iowa Writers' Workshop to national prominence. The 1960s would be a tumultuous decade. Engel's network grew increasingly international, bringing more foreign writers to the workshop and establishing a poetry translation program. Unlike the regionalists before him, Engel saw Iowa City not as a center for Midwest culture, but a hub for writers from around the globe.
To the University of Iowa have come poets from all the world's areas to prove that neither the harsh frontiers of nations nor the hard barriers of language can keep poetry, that radiant language of the heart, from speaking. By translations made with a deep love, both for the original language and for our English speech, they have tried to prove that all poetry speaks with a single voice.
But not everyone shared Engel's vision.
There was lots of resentment against Engel by the other professors in the English department because of Engel's single-minded emphasis on the workshop. An English department is a relatively staid bureaucratic structure, and it doesn't have a lot of space for the kind of entrepreneurial energies that Engel was exercising. Although I think other people might have used less friendly terms.
You know, no matter what I'm doing, eating or washing or walking or teaching, I always think about poetry. And always about poetry, Chinese poetry, Turkish poetry, any poetry.
You couldn't stop Paul. Paul was a steamroller. And Paul could talk to any kind of group. He could raise money from, the utility company. He would often get up to answer the phone in the back room, and then he would come back and announce something like the Natural Gas Fellowship. And it would all be true.
In fact, by this time, Engel was frequently absent. He was part of the Kennedy administration's cultural programming. He was frequently in D.C. and New York at the same time as the workshop was growing to a size where it needed actually more as opposed to less attention. There was a confrontation which involved all of the other members of the English department. There was lots of academic gossip and dissension and talk about it. And essentially, Engel had put himself in opposition to the entrenched, tenured power structure of the department.
The conflict between Engel and the English faculty came to a head in 1965. Engel resigned as director of the workshop. But the groundwork had been laid for a new literary experiment. By 1965, Paul Engel had turned a small writing course nicknamed the Writer's Workshop into the nation's top writing program. But his time as director was not without conflict. By the time he stepped down, though, Engel had new plans. Since the late 50s, Engel had brought foreign writers to Iowa City and started a workshop to translate work of foreign poets. So when the Chinese novelist Walling Nia suggested a program for international writers, Engel imagined a new literary venture. The International Writing Program, established in 1967, would bring prominent writers from around the world to Iowa City, providing them time to write and experience American life.
Engel, to a certain degree, realized that there was an opportunity internationally analogous to the opportunity he had noticed 2 decades before nationally, which is that there was an absence of institutions to house and organize the international writing scene.
For 25 years, I brought young American poets to Iowa City. This little town, surrounded by cornfields, with pastures full of cattle, a state raising so much food, suddenly had more poets per capita than any of the great cities of the world. It was a crazy idea to bring poets to this little place. And yet, I felt it is the imagination that brings all men together. It isn't politics or economics or history. It's the imagination. So all writers from the world ought to come to Iowa City. So the International Writing Program was begun. This was an even crazier idea. But the poets came from Latin America, from Egypt.
I got to Iowa City in 1967, and there were 2 scenes going on here. There was a heavy political scene and a heavy literary scene, and they blended perfectly. The year before I came, Allen Ginsberg had come, and all of my friends made it absolutely clear to me that I was nothing because I hadn't seen that. And too bad you missed it, Paul. But the first year I was here, there was stuff that was going on that I had never dreamed of. And if I hadn't been sold on Iowa City for a sort of a thrilling literary ride, nothing was going to make me feel that good.
With trademark zeal, Engel, along with Walling, put his considerable fundraising and recruiting skills into the International Writing Program. In 1971, he married Walling, and with the support of the State Department and private corporations, the International Writing Program would bring hundreds of foreign writers to Iowa City. For their efforts in connecting writers worldwide, Paul and Walling Engel will be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1976.
We are dealing with older and established writers who are here not as students, not as tourists, not as guests, but as artists whose form is language. It seems to me, therefore, that this ought to be a symbol of the world in which people who are imaginative. Know and trust people who are imaginative. After all, if you are reading poetry to each other, you are not fighting each other.
The Writers' Workshop moved on without Paul Engel, but its reputation was established. The success of the program had impact outside of Iowa as well.
What Engel did was put a system in place that once he left, not only could it run of its own energies in Iowa, it was replicating itself all across the country. And so that, which meant that people who started programs in other universities would want to send their undergrads here to Iowa. And it was branded as an Iowa invention by the time Engel left.
A writer isn't someone who's published. A writer is somebody who writes. And it's really important to me. I'm not great about working every day, but I try to. And even if I'm writing just kind of some longhand stuff, I'm using my writing muscles. So to me, a writer is somebody who writes consistently.
Well, every kid in kindergarten is a writer and a painter and a dancer. And, you know, all those things are there. You know, one by one, people check out of the gamble. They think it's crazy. And I guess it is.
I like to think less about Robert the writer than Robert trying to make a work of art. How can you make something more interesting? And writing is one way to do that.
Every reader is a writer, for a start. What the reader does is to take these little black ink stains on a page, that's all they are, and turn them into a story.
The Writers' Workshop today is an institution with elegant facilities, funding, and highly selective admissions. But the program is much like it was in the days of Engel, still divided into poetry and fiction, still turning out successful writers and teachers of writing.
People come from all over the country to the program because they want feedback on their work. And they don't simply want to be told that the work is outstanding and gorgeous. They want to be told what they can do to move to the next level. And that can be hard to hear. But I think most students end up being glad that they heard it.
Led up to it. So she seems to be telling the story from a place.
So instead of me being the person who pronounces on the work, I think it's more that we look for the work to speak to us, and then we try to figure out a way to make it a stronger version of what it wants to be. So we spend a lot of time talking about what the story is in its essence and what it would be if it were as good as it could possibly be, how to move the writer up to the next level. We are 3.5 hours from Chicago, 4 hours from Omaha, 5 hours from Minneapolis and Kansas City, and 6 hours from St. Louis. And so we really have a thriving culture because everybody who's here has a stake in being here. Nobody can just flee. I also think that our isolation helps the writers who come here. There's less for them to be distracted by. Winter is good. It makes people hole up and work really hard. I think that Paul Engel had a great role in bringing amazing writers to this campus and making this campus a destination for writers, and that tradition is still true.
When you teach fiction writing, you have such an intimate look into people's lives. There's really nothing quite like it. I think it stimulates me here because so much of what I read is so good. I think if you read bad stuff, it can discourage you as a writer. But I read 6 or 7 stories a semester that I don't think I could have written myself. And that's wonderful. Another thing is you realize, after a certain point, you realize that everything you're saying to your students, you're actually saying to yourself. The thing about writing is that, fiction writing at least, is that I think you need 2 things, 2 sort of large personality traits to get it done. And one is kind of a sense of manic invention, to be able to throw yourself into a manic stage, to be inventive, to be confident enough to do something original, to be wild enough, you know, to type 500 pages out of your own head. The same person also has to be sort of logical and rigorous and have sort of a pretty severe editorial function so that you don't publish junk. So I'll spend a couple of months building up a couple hundred pages, say, and then I will spend a couple of months organizing it. And I always make storyboards, which is what screenwriters do. And I use all kinds of techniques. I use different colors for different plots. I have one right here where each plot is a different color. And that's sort of the only way you can look at something, I can look at something I'm making and sort of understand what the reader's experience of it might be at that moment. So I teach that way, and I try to think about fiction that way as made up of pieces. And then, you know, you try to read the damn thing, and you try to read it as though you didn't know you wrote it, which is very, very hard. I often find that if I read my students' work before, or read something else that I read a good piece of student work, or else something else that I really like, I can kind of get myself into that mood where fiction seems real.
I am Laurel Fantuzzo, and I moved here from New York, and I grew up in Southern California. All of my writer friends who knew I had gotten into Iowa all said, Iowa, you know, oh my God. And then all of my other friends said Iowa. It just seemed a little desolate to me compared to New York. It just felt very, very small, and I worried that I would feel very lonely.
Small round beanbags nestled in a rectangular box. Who wants to learn? You asked the class, but you winked it.
Workshop is a funny organism. I think people have a lot of different, I guess, experiences and feelings about it.
With the number, you get a sense of the institution.
You know, we always start out positive with something nice. You need to be not so much about ego and competition, but more about supporting and enriching what your classmate is trying to do, because otherwise it is just competition.
So that's the only thing about the form is...
I actually do not enjoy writing, and I know that's probably a crazy thing to say being at Iowa, but it's so lonely, and you really have to fight with yourself.
I think especially in the sister D.
Coming here, I stayed really skeptical until about the last minute about whether or not this was going to work for me, and I think it will.
Yeah, I agree. That's very good. Well, let's begin with your question.
When I take a cab here, inevitably the cab driver will say, "So are you a writer?" I don't think this happens in many parts of the world, really, and not necessarily in many parts of the US.
In the vastness of America, what seems to work is the community, the small communities, the small towns life. And I think apart from being a literary hub, it's a university campus full of students and scientific and literature production going on. But on the other hand, what I felt here is that small community that gets together and gets things done.
What I'll get of Iowa City is this sense that there is a community of writers out there. I've never been to anywhere where there were so many writers in one place, where being a writer was seen as something so ordinary and wonderful at the same time, where you could actually be yourself. You know, it's like, this is a fish that's gone back to water, having spent ages in little ponds.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't know. I dance around that a bit.
I wouldn't define it as, spiritual in the going to church sense of things.
I like blasphemy.
Oh, I wouldn't do it if I didn't think there was a tremendous spiritual benefit, not only to the reader, but to the writer.
Well, it certainly is meditative. I mean, you have to go into another world when you're writing, a world apart.
I take it quite seriously as a philosophical investigation, but spiritual.
For me, there's a lot of spiritual force in taking God's name in vain.
In writing words that try to capture experience, to try to remember lost time, it inherently becomes a spiritual activity. of trying to understand the inner core of something. So I think it is entirely spiritual.
If I connect with other people as a writer and I connect with readers, then there's something spiritual about it that I just think can't really be named, but which is good. It's ineffable, which I think is what it has to be.
I don't know. It's profound. I know it's profound, and I know it can rock my world, but I don't know quite how to talk about it.
You know, Yeats says that all poetry comes from the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, and I think all fiction comes from there too. But the foul rag and bone shop of the heart can be a very holy place.
In the wake of the Writers' Workshop, literary arts thrive in Iowa City. When Wilbur Schramm returned to Iowa after the war to lead the School of Journalism, he took another innovative step, establishing a typographic laboratory at the university. This concentration of expertise in bookmaking would later give rise to a fine press movement in Iowa City.
These were small 1-2 person shops where people would lay out books by hand using old-fashioned printing techniques. Poetry and short stories got published that way. And again, very finely crafted with such a careful hand. They were just absolutely beautiful objects and again express that love that people have for books in this community.
The typographic laboratory is now the Center for the Book, integrating expert craftsmanship with the study of the book in society.
You know, you would think, gosh, well, why should any university have a program in paper making or books and paper? Aren't they passé? I mean, isn't this the digital age? But you got to remember that for 18 centuries, every piece of paper in the world was made by hand. And after 1800, when the paper machine was invented, a tremendous amount of paper was produced by a machine. And there's a tremendous history of transmission of literature, ideas via books and paper. The digital revolution that we're in the midst of, the idea that the book may in fact be disappearing in many forms, has made people suddenly more aware of the book and of paper. And if you think about it, the book has been a very, very functional, user-friendly device for centuries. And I think whoever invents what comes next digitally needs to really understand why that codex book structure has been so effective. Books and paper give words a place to lie down, according to a poet friend of mine.
Each June and July, festivals and workshops bring writers and readers to Iowa City.
The Summer Writing Festival brings hundreds of people through here. People that live in California, that live in the Dakotas, that live in Carolina. And they come here being doctors, lawyers, insurance salesmen, whatever. And for a week, for the Summer Writing Festival, they're writers. Because their teachers say they are, and because they let themselves be that, and the city responds to that. I think everyone's a writer if you put in the time and let yourself do it.
Always in all of these, 1 or 2 brief moments where someone slammed an adjective against a noun that just cracked everyone up, right?
Young Writer Studio is a very selective program. You get hundreds and hundreds of applications of kids that just want to be here, and he can't take all of them. So the people he has here, the best of the best. I mean, I'm frightened by the talent these students have. And again, as a writer myself, if I spend an afternoon or an evening working with a student on their work, it makes me want to go home and also write. And that's what you get in the graduate workshop, and it's what you get in any good community. This city and this university care so much about letting people express themselves on the page that every summer I choose to come back here to be around it. Jesus, you walk down the street and there's words carved into the street. And you're literally walking on language in here. And I think that that's something that if you can't be energized by that, maybe you're not a writer. But I think everyone can be a writer.
This community of writers is now branding itself. In 2008, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization approved Iowa City as the world's 3rd city of literature.
The fact that it is UNESCO is significant in terms of the heightened importance of what we might call cultural diplomacy in the post-war world, right? UNESCO was basically set up under the premise that cultural exchange could enhance world peace and world political amity. So the designation of Iowa is a recognition of Engel's success in instituting that vision, that Iowa City is not just a literary center, but that Iowa City represents an element in a worldwide effort at cultural diplomacy and cultural relationships.
I kind of wish the term was City of Writers, but I understand why it's City of Literature. Literature's a big sounding word, isn't it?
It's not the kind of place that I would go around saying, "Hey, did you hear? We're a city of literature." You know, first it just sounds like it would be in poor taste, and second, I believe that a lot of cities can be cities of literature if people will pay attention to what's there, to the beauty of literature.
Edward, Prince of Wales, with Princess Alexandra, and King George with Queen Mary. Below them on the table stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. He kept his own counsel on his white frozen lake, the marble-topped table. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. Come, said
Literature will take you places that there's no chance you're ever going on your own.
In the pattern of imagery and idea, in the cadence of verses, in the plots and the characters who take on lives of their own in a literary work, we find ways to understand ourselves. We broaden our powers of empathy. We engage in that most intimate of acts. We are with ourselves in dialogue with some imagined other. That is a wonderful antidote to the speeded up lives that we now live. It's always been an important part of the human condition to have ways to tell stories to ourselves and ways to tell the stories of the places where we live. And in literature, that's what we do.
He shook hands. He made it clear that he loved literature, was buying books for his children.
Good recommendations.
In a way, it was more wonderful when he mentioned Prairie Lights and the whole audience cheered.
So let me talk to you about what this means for a business like your own, Prairie Lights bookstore downtown.
You know, that matters. It made me feel like the town loves its bookstore.
That all died away before I arrived. And thank you also for that exceedingly kind and generous introduction. This place is sort of my spiritual home, Iowa City. So I come here every chance I get.
Born in New York, filmmaker Nicholas Meyer came to the University of Iowa in the mid-60s to study film and theater.
Well, the funny part that sealed the deal was I looked at a bulletin board and it said that there were still tickets available to the Budapest String Quartet. And any worries I had about Iowa City were put to rest. I just thought, Christ, I can't get tickets to the Budapest String Quartet in New York. I'll be better off here. I just fell in love with it. I had never seen anything like this in my life, and it spoke to me. And particularly out of the theater department, I was taught by real masters. I was taught by Howard Stein. I was taught by Peter Arnott. These were people who really broke down what drama was and how it worked.
This led to something very important for me. I said I am never again reading a Shakespeare play until I've seen it. So when I was here as an undergraduate, I saw my own theater department's production of King Lear. And I was the only person in the audience who didn't know what was going to happen next. And it remains the single greatest theatrical experience of my life. I was even all these years now, I can scarcely speak of it.
It's like coming home. This is the first place I was happy. This is the place that gave me a chance to sort of start over. It was very meaningful to me. And I come back every chance I get because I got so much from this place. I owe them big time.
In 2011, the Writers' Workshop celebrated its 75th anniversary. Poets and Writers currently rates Iowa the #1 graduate program in creative writing. The International Writing Program has brought the world to Iowa for nearly 45 years. Iowa City celebrates this heritage, but there are few reminders of the people who long ago forged a community of writers in the heart of America.
I don't think we're ever going to know all of the cast of characters. This was a huge community of people over many generations that contributed to what eventually has become what we call the City of Literature. There were people who never will be known in our imagination or our minds, but they were key people to what transpired in this town.
George Cram Cook, who taught Iowa's first creative writing class in 1897, headed east to form the Provincetown Players Theater Group. John Frederick, whose Midland made Iowa City a hub for writers, folded his magazine during the Depression. Wilbur Schramm, who founded the Writers' Workshop and later the Iowa Typography Lab, made an even larger impact in the field of communication studies. Paul Engel retired from the International Writing Program in 1978, and Hua Ling stayed on as director. Engel died in 1991 at O'Hare Airport, on his way to Europe to receive an award from the government of Poland.
When you are so eager, as Walling and I are, to do new things, then you don't get old. You keep always new. And in that way, when we look ahead, we are not looking back. We think, oh, 5 years from now, what writers will be here from Yugoslavia, from Japan, from the new African countries. And of course this makes us feel hopeful. We believe, you see.
Engel's plan was to route all of American writing and much of European and Asian writing through Iowa City, and few plans have been more effectively realized. In my essay on Engel, I call him a vanishing mediator. This is a term from Max Weber's sociological theory. A vanishing mediator is someone who brings a change into being, but once the change comes into being, his or her significance vanishes and they frequently are forgotten. Engel is not entirely forgotten. We have a Paul Engel Day here, and Chris Merrill, in fact, has been instrumental in sort of reminding people who Engel was. But because Engel was not recognized, ironically, for his creative work, his historical mark on this city is relatively thin and light. We don't have a scholarship named after him. We don't have a street named after him. We don't have a building named after him. I promise you that at least half of the students in the workshop probably have never even heard of him and certainly have never read his poetry.
At 70, beat up, jailed for the crime of beating horror, beauty into rhyme, I walked the blacked out cell block of my brain. Sure I am mad, but sure that I am sane. A cornfield kid, crazy for English words. Old scarecrow lonesome for the screaming birds.
I think it was good that for so long the director of the workshop was a poet. You don't make money writing poetry, and you don't have a big audience writing poetry. So you must be doing it because you need to, and because you're getting something out of it you wouldn't get otherwise, and because it's a new way of thinking, a different way of thinking, because it uses words to get beyond words, because it finds words for emotions, which themselves, of course, have no words. Words are words and emotions are emotions. But all art is about what life feels like, finally. That's inside you. Your real life is inside you. The rest of your life, you'll never be free. You have to, make a living, put clothes on, all that kind of thing. In art, you are free. In art, you are absolutely free. The poem is called Writers in a Cafe. Under the title, it says, for the designation of Iowa City, a UNESCO City of Literature 2008. Amid semi-trailers hauling produce, grown in the deep blue-black topsoil left mid-country by an inexpressible ice age, there is known to be a place where words have dirt on their shoes, where sky reaches to girdle the globe, the earth is etched by signs and portents. Many have bowed to their writing in attics and basements, at rest by the river or paused on a bridge, in the shadow of winter or eclipse, voicing local lives and affairs of state, as much by the reflections of leaves and the glow of prairie grasses left to live in the mind as by shapes in clouds or the dark news. They were here who made the sentence behave and misbehave, who added chapter and verse and recast the myths. The cafe grows quiet as they write. The espresso machine lets go the steam someone may write in on the mirror. It is an impulse that survives disaster. The guns fail when surrounded by writing.
To learn more about this program, to watch it online, or to order a DVD of this program, visit cityofliteratureFilm.org. The preceding program was produced by the University of Iowa, with support from State Historical Society Incorporated, Humanities Iowa and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Iowa Arts Council.